Welcome back to our disaster management course. I am Dr. Muni Pradeep, Assistant Professor, Department of Civil Engineering, SR University. So we are continuing our Unit 1, Introduction to Disaster Management, and today we are on Lecture 4. So our topic for this session is Prevention and Mitigation Strategies. So this lecture also I will explain in two parts, both Part A and Part B. In our previous lectures, we saw how disasters destroy livelihoods, displace families, contaminate environment, and reverse decades of development progress. So today we shift our focus from the problem to the actual solution. So having understood what disasters are and what they will do or what they can do, so the most important question now is what can we do about them? So what can we do about the disasters, and how do we stop disasters from happening, or at least reduce the harm, reduce the intensity of harm what they caused, right? So I'm repeating. So what can we do about the disasters, and how do we stop disasters from happening, or at least we'll reduce the intensity, the stress, the disaster intensity they cause to the humankind. So that is precisely what today's lecture is all about. We'll study the concepts of prevention, mitigation, the preparedness. The preparedness means the proactive, forward-looking activities that form the most important phase of the disaster management cycle. So we'll look at both structural approaches as well as non-structural approaches that we'll discuss in the coming class. So by the end of the lecture 4, you people should be able to explain the full disaster management cycle, which defines the prevention and mitigation and the distinguish between the structural and non-structural mitigation measures, and apply these concepts to real Indian case studies. So what is structural and non-structural, that I'll explain in the coming lecture. So with this, I'll start the lecture 4, part A. So, before I start the lecture 4, I'll quickly recap the previous lecture, that is lecture 3, both part A and part B, which covered the impacts of disasters across social, economic, and environmental dimensions. So, this recap is very, very important because today's strategies are the direct responses to the whatever impacts we discussed in the previous class. So every mitigation measures we discussed today, it is designed to prevent one or more of the whatever the harms we studied in the last lecture, that is lecture 3. So under the impacts of disasters, we have established that disasters impacts extended far beyond immediate physical destruction, and which affects the society, the economy, the public health, as well as natural environment simultaneously, and that these impacts are deeply unequal, falling hardest on the poorest and the most marginalized communities. All these impacts, the deaths, the displacement, the economic losses, the environmental destruction, are the problems that today's lecture on prevent and mitigation is designed to address. So now let us now look at these solutions one by one. So coming to the first slide, this slide is all about the disaster management cycle. So before we dive into the prevention and mitigation strategies, we must first understand the framework within which all the disaster management activities are taking place. So that is called disaster management cycle. So this is one of the most important conceptual models in the entire field of disaster management. You can see the image here, that is disaster management cycle. The first point on this slide makes a historically important observation, very important observation. So in earlier times, disaster management was primarily focusing on the relief measures after a disaster had already occurred. So if some disaster happened, if disaster already occurred, so after that, the disaster management was primarily focused on relief measures after any incident happened. This approach was essentially a reactive approach. So we are in general we are waiting for the disaster to happen, then we are response with food, medicine and shelter. This approach, while necessary, was deeply inadequate. It did nothing to prevent the next disaster from causing the same or greater harm. See, we are not even learned anything from that this point of view. So over the time, particularly through the work of United Nations and the involvement of international disaster research institutions and the painful lessons learned from the major disasters around the world, it was recognized that the prevention and mitigation of disasters which can prevent enormous human suffering and infrastructural losses. This shift in thinking from reactive relief to the proactive risk reduction. So initially we are reacting to disaster. Now we are focusing on proactive risk reduction. It is one of the most significant advances in disaster management thinking in the past 50 years. So this disaster management cycle, which is illustrated in the figure on this slide, it consists of four main phases that operates in a continuous loop. It is not a linear system; it is a continuous loop system. So I'll let me describe the each phase. The first one is phase one. The phase one is about the prevention and mitigation. So this slide will be I'll explain in detail. It will take some time. So the phase one, the prevention and mitigation. So this is comes under pre-disaster phase. So in this phase, whatever the activities carried out before a disaster strikes to reduce the likelihood of a disaster occurring or to reduce the severity of its impact if it does occur also. See here in the prevention and mitigation phase, this is comes under pre-disaster phase. So here whatever the activities we are carried out before a disaster strikes to the community to reduce the likelihood of a disaster occurring or to reduce the severity of its impacts, whatever the impacts we discussed in the last lecture. The examples include, say before um, earthquake occurred only, we are constructing the earthquake resistant buildings and we constructed the buildings with the flood embankments and we are establishing the early warning systems. We are enacting and enforcing the building codes and we'll allow the people to follow those rules and we are conducting community awareness programs. This is the phase we'll focus on most deeply in today's lecture. So because the today lecture is all about how we prevent and how we mitigate before disaster occurred and during the disaster. Now coming to the phase two, that is the preparedness. The first one is about prevent. The second phase is about preparedness. So also this also comes under pre-disaster activity only. The preparedness refers to the specific planning and readiness activities that enable rapid and effective responses when a disaster does strike. So during that activity, how actively we are reacting to that activities, how actively we are reacting to that situations. So this preparedness includes developing emergency responding plans, evacuation plans, and we are giving training to the rescue teams and the stockpiling of emergency supplies, food supplies, conducting evacuation drills, and we are establishing a communication protocols. So the difference between the prevention and the preparedness is, see, the first phase is prevention, the second phase is preparedness. The basic difference is in the prevention, we'll try to stop the disaster or to reduce its occurrence. During the preparedness, we accept that the disaster may happen and we're ensuring that the response will be fast, organized and effective. Okay, so in the preparedness, we are already accepting the situation that disaster may happen and we are ready to face that situation. So this is the phase two. Now coming to the third phase, that is response. So this is the during disaster and immediately post disaster phase. So while during the disaster and immediately the short span of time after the post disaster phase. So whatever the actions we are taken in the intermediate aftermath of a disaster to protect the life and to minimize the damage and to meet very urgent needs. So the response activities, which includes the search operations and rescue operations and the emergency medical care and the evacuation plans. We are speeding up the evacuation activities, and we are distributing the food and water to the needy people, and we are providing the temporary shelters. So the effectiveness of response the mainly depends upon almost entirely on how well preparedness was carried out in the pre-disaster phase. So this total response, the efficiency of the response, is totally depending upon the second phase, that is the preparedness. And the final one, the phase 4, which is recovery. This is the post-disaster phase. After disaster occurred, after certain time, so we are talking about the recovery. We are talking about the phase 4, that is recovery. The medium and long-term activities aimed at restoring normal life and rebuilding the affected communities. So the recovery includes rehabilitation of displaced persons. So many people are displaced, so we are rehabilitating them, and then reconstructing of damaged infrastructure, which includes road, dams, reservoirs, all civil engineering constructions, and we are restoration of livelihoods, and the psychological support. We discuss whatever we discussed in the last class: post tension stress disorder, post traumatic stress disorder, PTSD. We are providing the psychological support for the PTSD survivors. Importantly, good recovery incorporates will reduce the risk for the next time, and we are rebuilding in a way that which reduces vulnerability to the next disaster rather than simply restoring what existed before. We are not copying what existed before. We are simply importing all the building laws uh, and to reduce the vulnerability. So the crucial insight of the disaster management cycle is that it is a cycle, it is not a linear process. The recovery leads back to preventing and mitigation. So from the recovery, we understand the real problems, we understand the real situations. So we are incorporating into the prevention and mitigation. So each disaster provides important lessons that should inform better prevention, better preparedness, and responses for the next future disasters. So a community that learns from each disaster and uses recovery to build back the better infrastructure is one that becomes progressively more resilient over the time. So the best example in our India is Orissa, right? These four phases are very important in disaster management cycle. So now, next slide is about, we are discussing about the disaster prevention versus disaster mitigation. So first I'll explain the definitions, then we'll go through the in detail explanation. So now let us look very carefully at the definitions of the two terms that are often used interchangeably but have distinct and important meanings. So it look both are same, but there is a lot of distinctness. Two clear way of definitions, that is prevention and mitigation. So understanding this distinction is a fundamental to everything what we'll study today. So one has to clearly distinguish between the difference between prevention and the mitigation. So what is the prevention? Prevention activities aim at totally avoiding the adverse impacts of hazards. Okay, I'll give you 30 seconds time. You just go through the definitions. You just go through the table, both prevention as well as mitigation. Then I'll explain. So first we'll talk about the definitions and the meaning. In coming slides, I'll explain in detail. Right? So the prevention activities mainly aiming at totally avoiding the adverse impact of hazards, and we are providing means to minimize the environmental, technological and all biological disasters. So the key word in the definition of prevention is totally avoiding. We are simply avoiding the situation. We are simply avoiding the disaster. So prevention is the attempt to eliminate the disaster risk entirely 100% to ensure that the hazard does not cause any kind of harm at all. So this is the most ambitious goal in the disaster management, and it is not always achievable. Right? Some hazards, particularly natural ones like earthquakes, volcanic eruptions, cyclones, tsunamis, So they cannot be prevented from occurring because it is entirely on nature. However, many man-made and technological hazards can be prevented through very strict regulations, the good engineering design, and careful management. So the examples of prevention measures, which includes, see, how we can prevent: prohibiting construction in high-risk floodplains so that no buildings are exposed to flood hazard. Right? First, don't give permission to that fellow who wants to construct on the floodplains. And we are enforcing a very strict industrial safety regulations to prevent the chemical plant accidents, and the maintaining the forest cover on hillsides to prevent landslides. And we are giving vaccinating populations against epidemic diseases before some outbreak will occur. So these all are comes under prevention. So we are not letting that disaster will happen. Each of these examples, whatever the examples we explained till now, the aim is to prevent the disaster from happening at all, not just to reduce its impacts. Our main aim is to eliminate it. So when prevention is successful, there is no disaster to respond to, there is no destruction to repair, and there is no life to mourn. This is why prevention is always the most cost effective and most human form of disaster management. So, but my question is it possible? No, it's not 100% achievable. Then what? Then we are going to the next segment, that is called mitigation. So the mitigation means any actions taken to minimize the extent of a disaster or potential disaster. I'm repeating again, mitigation means any action taken to minimize the extent or intensity of a disaster or any potential disaster. So unlike prevention, mitigation does not aim to eliminate the disaster entirely. It accepts the fact that the disaster may occur or that some level of harm is unavoidable, and we are mainly focusing on reducing that harm as much as possible. So the mitigation is all about damage limitation. So here we are accepting the fact it may occur, and where our main focus is to damage the mitigation. So a very important point on this slide: mitigation can take place before also, during also, and after a disaster also. But the term is most often used proactively to refer to actions taken against potential future disasters. See, the pre-disaster mitigation is the most effective form. See, pre-disaster mitigation, before disaster occur only, what are the mitigation techniques? It is far cheaper and more effective to reinforce a building before an earthquake than to try to limit casualties during one. So I'm repeating, it is far more cheaper and more effective to reinforce a building before an earthquake occurs. If earthquake occurs, that building is self-sufficient, it can resist that earthquake. So there is no casualties. And the examples of mitigation measures, see, you may have one doubt. Then reinforcing a building is comes under prevention? No. See, the prevention is we are not accepting that earthquake may occur. So that's why it is prevention. But here we are reinforcing a earthquake resistant building. That means we are accepting a fact that earthquake may occur. So my building has to resist the earthquake loading. So that's why it comes under mitigation. The examples of mitigation measures, which includes designing a buildings to withstand earthquakes, even if they cannot prevent the earthquake from occurring. So we discussed already. Second one, constructing cyclone shelters so that when a cyclone strikes, people will go to safe places to take the refuge. And installing early warning systems. So what form of early warning systems, that I'll explain in the coming classes. So installing early warning systems so that even when a flood or tsunami or cyclone occurred, people have time to evacuate. And constructing embankments and levees to control flood water. This is mainly related to civil engineering students. To summarize the distinction clearly, the prevention says this disaster will not happen. So what prevention says? This disaster will not happen. But what mitigation says? Mitigation says this disaster may happen, but we will ensure its impact is as small as possible. Right? What mitigation says? The disaster may happen, but we are ready to face it and the impact is as small as possible. These both prevention as well as mitigation are very much essential, and in practice most disaster risk reduction programs involves a combination of both prevention as well as mitigation. I hope you understand, because this is very important, because this lecture is all about the discussing the solutions. Next, you can see this one. Let us now look at the disaster management cycle in terms of three temporal stages: before the disaster, during the disaster, and after the disaster. So this is a practical way to organize all disaster management activities and understand when each type of activity is very relevant. The first one, pre-disaster phase. The pre-disaster phase encompasses three types of activities, that is preparedness, prevention and mitigation. We already discussed about prevention and mitigation. What is preparedness? See, what I'm talking about? I'm talking about the pre-disaster phase, before disaster about to occur. What kind of plans we have? The preparedness, as we discussed, involves getting ready to respond. This includes developing emergency response plans, training the rescue teams and relief teams, stockpiling the food grains, we discussed already. And then you know about the prevention as well as mitigation. Now coming to during the disaster phase. During the disaster phase, so responses and reliefs. During the disaster phase, which involves responses and reliefs, this is the period of immediate crisis. So it is already, that area is already exposed to the, already impacted by the disaster. So this is a period of immediate crisis. From the moment the disaster strikes until the immediate threat to life has been controlled. So the response activities, which includes search and rescue operations, emergency medical treatments, evacuation plans, evacuation of affected population. See, some people, they already affected, they injured, they cannot evacuate, they cannot move from that place. So in such cases, we'll evacuate those people. And the emergency distribution of food, water, all necessary things. The speed and effectiveness of the disaster response mainly depending upon how well the pre-disaster pays. Okay, you can see, I'll explain the figure later. The post-disaster phase, which talking about the recovery, rehabilitation and reconstruction. Recovery is the immediate post-disaster period. Recovery is the immediate post-disaster period, which restoring basic services, the clearing the debris, providing the temporary housing, and beginning the process of returning to the normal life. These all three comes under post-disaster phase. The rehabilitation is the medium-term process of restoring livelihood, health services, education, and social systems, which includes providing financial support to the affected families, restoring agricultural operations, rebuilding the schools and hospitals, and providing psychological counseling to survivors. So this reconstruction is a long-term process of rebuilding damaged or destroyed infrastructure. So the homes, the roads, bridges, public buildings, ideally with improved design standards that reduce vulnerability to the future disasters, and the concept of building back, build back better. So enriched in this Sunday framework for disaster risk reduction, which means that reconstruction should not simply restore what existed before, but we should create a safe, the more resilient built environment. So next one is about, this slide presents an extremely valuable case study, a real world application of the disaster management cycle to the Uttarkasi disaster of 2025. So till now I talked about prevention, mitigation, pre-disaster phase, response, recovery. So I talked about many theoretical terms. So this table will provide the case study what happened on Uttarkasi disaster 2025. So I'll explain all this prevention, mitigation, preparedness, response, recovery, everything in the context of Uttarkasi disaster 2025. Okay. So what is Uttarkasi disaster 2025? First, I'll explain the disaster. The Uttarkasi 2025 disaster was a devastating flash flood and debris flow in Uttarakhand caused by the sudden mountain ice collapse and heavy water flow in the Himalayan region. Right. Just I'm repeating again. The Uttarkasi disaster, it happened in 2025. What is this? This disaster was a devastating flash flood. Flash flood means too much of flood uh, accumulated within a short span of time. So I'll explain the flash floods in flood concept in the coming classes, unit 2. So it was a accumulation of high intensity flood in very short time, and along with the flow, a lot of debris flow in Uttarakhand, which is caused by there is a sudden mountain ice collapse and heavy water flow in the Himalaya region. So this disaster destroyed houses, the roads, the bridges, the pilgrim or the hotels constructed for the pilgrimage, and the total communication system within a fraction of minutes, which causing deaths, the displacements, and the economic losses. So you actually the total houses, all buildings are also disappear within a fraction of seconds. So, from the disaster management perspective, what this Uttarkasi disaster 2025 highlights, because it is not even 1 year. So the which highlights the fragile Himalayan ecology. Second one, climate change impacts, how suddenly the climate is changing, and the risks of unplanned construction in vulnerable zones. There is a lot of construction activities were not allowed, but still many people constructed the hotels, all pilgrimage activities. And then there is a need for early warning systems and hazard mapping. So what is hazard mapping? That also I'll discuss in the coming classes. And the early warning systems. And there is an importance of preparedness and sustainable development. So here there is one new term called sustainable development. So what is sustainability? See, today we have water, food, everything. So 30, 40 years before, our fathers, forefathers, they have even ample quantity of water. So same natural resources, whether we are transferring to our next generations or not, in a sustainable way. We need development, but the development should be in a sustainable way. So without creating harm to the nature, to the environment, whether we are transferring our resources, everything to our future generations, that comes under sustainable development. Okay, so this Uttarkasi 2025 disaster is a very strong example of how a natural hazard becomes a disaster. So it is usually actually a hazard. When all the people are following the building laws, there is no construction activities are allowed. So it was actually a natural hazard. But why it became the disaster? Because it is interacting with the vulnerable communities and the infrastructure. Okay, so the table on this slide compares phase by phase what should have happened according to the best practices in disaster management. See here, three columns are there. The central column is talking about what should have happened according to the best practices in disaster management. That is the ideal column. So the third column is what actually happened in Uttarkasi. That is the actual column. So let us go through the each phase. The first one, prevention and mitigation phase. The first one is prevention and mitigation phase. So what should have happened actually? There is a comprehensive hazard mapping of cloudburst prone zones in the Uttarkasi hills. So if you have a hazard mapping, then we can give early warning systems. We don't have any hazard mapping. There is no there is no technology to map there may be chances of hazard, right? And active afforestation programs to stabilize the slopes. Now people are mainly focusing on deforestation and no one is focusing on afforestation activities. Afforestation means planting the trees. instead of cutting the trees. And then slope stability engineering work on vulnerable hillsides, because that is a landslide area, so we have to provide the proper slope stability. And strict regulation of construction on unstable hill terrain. So this is what actually happened. So this is what should have happened. But what actually happened there? Hazard mapping was outdated and not regularly updated, and the construction on hill slopes were poorly regulated. There is new building had been permitted in areas with known geological instability, and the deforestation had worsened the vulnerability of slopes. So these failures at the prevention and mitigation stage created the conditions for a severe disaster. So this tells us something very important. The damage done during the disaster phase is often not caused by the disaster event itself, but by the decades of very poor land management and inadequate regulation that processed it. The cloudburst that triggered the Uttarkasi disaster was a natural event, but the scale of destruction was largely a consequence of human decisions made over many years on Himalaya region. Right? So coming to the preparedness phase, that is a part one. So what should have happened? The communities in cloudburst prone zones should have regular evacuation drills. They have to know what happened. If something happened, how to evacuate from that area. And then functioning of SMS alert system, audible sirens, and trained local volunteers who know evacuation routes and emergency procedures. But what actually happened? Villagers received late warnings, the communication chain was too slow, no recent evacuation drills had been conducted, the communities were not adequately trained in emergency response procedures. The result was that when the disaster struck, people did not know where to go and what to do. So coming to the second preparedness phase, part 2. So what should have actually happened? There is a pre-identified emergency shelters. Pre-identified emergency shelters. The local people has to know where is the emergency shelters are exist. And pre-positioned emergency supply kits with proper food, water, medicines and first aid materials. And trained local disaster response teams, they are ready, NDRF, these kind of teams are ready to act before national teams arrive. But what actually happened? There is no emergency shelters had been identified and designated. There is no emergency supplies were not pre-positioned in that area. No local disaster response team is existed near to that area. When the disaster was struck, the community had to wait for NDRF and army teams to arrive from the outside. In the meantime, they lost everything. So during the response team, what should have happened? A fully coordinated response involving NDRF teams, army, medical teams and local administration all are working from a pre-existing response plan with clear command structures and communication protocols. But what actually happened? The army and NDRF team responded quickly and professionally. This is a genuine strength of India's national response capacity. However, local administration, the coordination was very weak and they failed. There was no clear local command structure, which leads to duplication of effort in some areas and gaps in other areas. And coming to the final phase, recovery phase, what should have happened? There is a rapid restoration of road accesses, adequate emergency shelters for displaced families, like trauma counseling centers, whatever we discussed in the last lecture. So what actually happened? Road access was delayed due to the scale of landslide damage. Many communities remained cut off for the extended periods. The shelter availability was inadequate. The mental health support was not provided. The recovery was very slow and painful. So what can we learn from this case study? Several importance. Okay. So what we learn from this case study, that I'll explain in the next class. I'll continue in the next class in the part B, lecture for part B, right? Then I'll complete the remaining lecture 4. Okay. So in the next lecture, I'll quickly start with what are the lessons we learned from the Uttarkasi 2025 disaster. All right. I hope you understand everything. So I try to explain in a very elaborated way because many students they thought that disaster management is not a simple theory subject. It is not even related to us. See, disaster management which involves all basic engineering domains. If you are a civil engineer, you are main focusing on the infrastructure. If you are a other software persons, you are mainly dealing with the early warning systems. So this subject is for everyone. So that's why I have elaborated the very lengthy way. I hope you understand because this is the ultimate goal of this course is to everybody will understand the importance of the disaster management. Okay, we'll meet you in the next class. Thank you. Bye.